The moment my son laughed at my wife's death, I knew I had to bury him financially. He stood over her coffin and whispered that the only thing I'd ever inherit was my own worthless debt. He had no idea his mother had hidden a $2 million treasure right under his greedy nose, using a clue only a broken-hearted old man could find. My name is William. I'm 70, and for 45 years, Eleanor was my world. She was the calm center, a geography teacher whose patience was endless, especially when dealing with the escalating tension between me and our son, Mark. Mark is a high-powered investment banker, successful, cynical, and utterly obsessed with wealth. Eleanor was the critical buffer between my quiet, pragmatic life and his ruthless financial world. When she passed away 2 years ago, the peace treaty ended. Mark immediately emerged as the shark he always was, circling me. On my personal balance sheet, there was a single, glaring line item: the $10,000 I borrowed from Eleanor a decade ago for my carpentry shop. I always intended to repay it, but when she died, Mark seized control of her records and instantly weaponized the loan. Every interaction, every check-in, was seasoned with humiliation. "Still got that $10K hanging over your head, Dad? I'll handle the estate. Can't have a debtor handling the real assets." He didn't need the money, he needed the control, the cruel satisfaction of reminding me that I was a financial failure, and he was the victor. If high-stakes revenge stories and hidden family secrets are your thing, hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss how this old man uses his wife's cryptic clue to turn the tables on his arrogant son. The worst moment came right after the memorial service. Mark pulled me into Eleanor's small sunlit geography study, the room with the enormous vintage world map covering the wall. His smile was cold and thin. "Listen, Dad," he whispered, "don't get any ideas. Mom didn't have much in her name. The house is complicated, and everything else is going into a trust I control. And that $10,000 you owe? I'm going to make sure the lawyer forgives it. Consider it my final act of charity. You'll get nothing else but the cancellation of your own pathetic debt." He smirked. The sheer contempt in his voice, the way he dismissed my entire life with Eleanor, burned in my chest. He walked away, already calculating his next move. I stayed in that study, staring at the map, the place where Eleanor and I planned our impossible trips. Mark's self-satisfied contempt was a powerful, toxic fuel. I had to hit him where it hurt, financially. But I was a retired carpenter facing a financial genius. It felt impossible. Yet, looking at the map, I remembered Eleanor's sharp, methodical mind. She knew Mark's greed. She wouldn't have left me defenseless. This map, her sanctuary, felt like the only hope I had. I ran my hand over its worn surface, turning panic into a cold, calculated resolve. I would wait for the will reading, but I felt deep down that Eleanor had already fought this battle for me. The lawyer's office was intentionally somber. Mark and I sat opposite each other, separated by Mr. Thompson's massive oak desk. Mark, dressed in a sharp, expensive suit, carried the air of a CEO conducting a hostile takeover, barely acknowledging my presence. I felt small and exposed, a retired carpenter facing the execution of his wife's final wishes and his son's toxic judgment. Mr. Thompson, stoic and professional, began reading Eleanor's last will and testament. The terms were exactly as Mark had predicted. The bulk of Eleanor's remaining liquid assets and the majority stake in the family home were to be placed in a long-term trust for Mark, given his expertise in management. Mark's mouth curled into a barely suppressed smile of satisfaction. My portion was read last, and it was devastatingly brief. "To my beloved husband, William R. Davies," Mr. Thompson read slowly, "I bequeath the cancellation of the $10,000 debt he currently holds with my estate." The silence was excruciating. Mark immediately seized the opportunity. He leaned forward, his voice a low, theatrical sneer. "There it is, Dad. Your great inheritance, the cancellation of a debt. I told you, Thompson, a zero net sum." He looked at the lawyer with utter contempt. A generous act, really. It ensures he walks away with nothing but his dignity intact. Barely. He had stripped the moment of all humanity, reducing Eleanor's final act to a simple financial transaction. His cruelty was deliberate, designed to ensure everyone in the room, including me, understood my perceived worthlessness. Mark actually checked his watch. "Can we wrap this up? The house title transfer is clean, the trust established. I believe that concludes the matter of the estate." But Mr. Thompson didn't move. He picked up a separate, smaller slip of paper from his file. "Not entirely, Mark. There is a final codicil, a specific handwritten note, included for William by Mrs. Eleanor." The tension in the room instantly shifted, thick and unexpected. Mark frowned, annoyed by the delay. Thompson put on his reading glasses, preparing to read the single, cryptic sentence. Mark was already halfway out of his chair, treating the meeting as a done deal, a clean, humiliating victory. But Mr. Thompson, the stoic lawyer, cleared his throat again, drawing our attention to the small, separate paper he still held. "There is one final codicil, a handwritten note specifically included for William by Mrs. Eleanor," he stated, his voice unchanging. Mark slumped back, annoyed. "More formalities? Just read it, Thompson. Let's not turn this into a sentimental soap opera. My father has his $10,000, or rather, his debt canceled. What's left? A poem?" His tone dripped with patronizing condescension, aimed not just at me, but at the memory of his own mother. Mr. Thompson ignored him, putting on his reading glasses. He unfolded the note, which was written in Eleanor's elegant, familiar script. He read the single sentence slowly, deliberately, into the cold silence of the office. "William, seek your treasure where we first dreamed of travels." The phrase hit me like a physical blow, yet it wasn't painful. It was a sudden, clear focus in the chaos. Where we first dreamed of travels. My mind immediately flashed back 30 years to our small apartment huddled over that very world map on the study wall, pointing at one icy, impossible island. It was our secret language, a final message of love and purpose. Mark, however, couldn't contain himself. He didn't just smile. He threw his head back and erupted in a short, hysterical burst of laughter, loud, sharp, and utterly devoid of warmth. "A treasure hunt?" he choked out, wiping a tear of cynical amusement from his eye. "Are you serious? Thompson, is this legally binding? This is pathetic. My mother, God rest her soul, must have been getting senile. She left a high-stakes financial negotiation and a multi-million-dollar trust to a fairy tale for a broken-down carpenter." He looked directly at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "Enjoy your quest for treasure, Dad. Maybe you'll find a bag of old coins or a lifetime supply of sawdust. You're dismissed. The estate is settled." The lawyer looked uncomfortable, but Mark had clearly dismissed the cryptic note as worthless eccentricity. Mark's laughter was the final brutal cut. It wasn't the loss of the money that hurt. It was the utter casual destruction of Eleanor's final gesture. In that moment, I stopped being a sad old man and became a determined adversary. His mocking laughter was the sound of my emotional ignition. He wanted me to be humiliated and empty-handed. I would make sure he was the one left with nothing but bile and regret. I stood up, met his arrogant gaze with a steady, blank look, and walked out without saying a word, carrying nothing but a powerful secret and a plan for revenge. Stepping back into Eleanor's study was like stepping into a sanctuary after being exposed to poison. The sterile air of the lawyer's office was gone, replaced by the faint, comforting scent of dry paper, old glue, and the lavender sachet she kept in her desk drawer. Mark's laughter echoed in my head, but now it sounded thin and distant, like static. His contempt was no longer a wound. It was the engine driving my focus. I approached the wall, where the massive vintage world map, the one Mark had casually ignored, dominated the room. It was faded in places, marked by decades of teaching, and our shared history. It wasn't pristine. It was lived in. I laid my hand flat against the North American continent, steadying myself, and whispered Eleanor's secret instruction. Seek your treasure where we first dreamed of travels. Mark had dismissed the phrase as sentimental rubbish. Saw money. Eleanor saw a timeline of our love. I didn't need a financial analyst to decode this. I needed a husband's memory. I closed my eyes, forcing my mind back through the years, past the family vacations, past the places we did manage to go. I needed the first dream. Suddenly, the image was perfectly clear. 1985, huddled together over this very map, young and broke, dreaming of the most impossible, distant place we could find. We laughed, but we pointed. It was Iceland, the land of fire and ice, the farthest and most financially ridiculous place a young carpenter and a new teacher could imagine visiting. That was the place. I grabbed the old step stool and carefully climbed up. The map was thick, mounted on cork, covered with thousands of tiny details. I meticulously scanned the area of the North Atlantic, my eyes burning as I searched the jagged coastline of Iceland. There were old, faded pins from her teaching days, tiny pencil notes on tectonic plates, but nothing that screamed, "Treasure here." Eleanor was too smart for an obvious X. My finger traced the curve of the island, moving slowly towards the capital, Reykjavik. I was about to give up, believing the clue was a dead end after all, when my fingertips brushed something almost imperceptible. I leaned closer, straining my eyes against the faded colors. It wasn't a pin or a smudge or a tear. It was a minute, intricate scratch of graphite, hidden right where the lines of latitude and longitude crossed the outline of the capital. It was smaller than a grain of rice, shaped like a tiny, stylized arrow pointing south. Anyone else would have wiped it away as a random imperfection, but I knew Eleanor's hand. It was precise, subtle, and incredibly deliberate. I felt a surge of cold triumph. The hunt was real. I stared at the microscopic graphite arrow on the map, its tip pointing resolutely south from Reykjavik. It was so small, so faint, that it could easily be mistaken for an imperfection in the paper, yet it was Eleanor's fingerprint, precise, subtle, and demanding attention. The arrow pointed away from the map itself, guiding me back into the room, past the bookshelves. I felt a thrilling mix of sadness and pride. She hadn't just left me money, she had left me a final, intimate puzzle. I got off the stool and let my gaze sweep across the study. It was less a financial puzzle and more an archival one, fitting for a geography teacher. The arrow pointed in the general direction of her personal collection of travel and exploration books. This collection was her pride and joy. Hundreds of heavy linen-bound volumes, organized not by author, but by region. Antarctica, the Himalayas, the Amazon, and of course a substantial section on the Nordic countries. I walked over, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight, and focused on the North Atlantic shelf. The arrow on the map had pointed me to Iceland, and now the books were my target. I mentally checked the inventory. There was a full 10-volume series she had collected since college, titled The World's Frozen Frontiers. Inside this series, there was only one volume dedicated solely to our first dream destination. I pulled out the volume, Volume Wharf, Iceland, A Geological History. It was thicker than the others, its spine slightly worn from years of use and reference. I ran my hands over the cover, expecting to find another subtle clue, perhaps a loose page or an inscription. Nothing. It looked entirely normal. I opened it carefully, fanning the pages, checking the margins for annotations, looking for anything out of place. This book was heavy, its pages dense, but as I flipped through the middle, something felt fundamentally wrong. The sound was the first thing. Instead of the soft, dry whisper of hundreds of pages separating, there was a dull, uniform thud. The weight, too, was odd. The book felt substantial around the edges, but hollow in the middle. I pressed down on the cover, and instead of the rigid resistance of stacked paper, I felt a slight give. I realized with a sudden electrifying jolt that the core of the book, the paper pages themselves, had been meticulously hollowed out. Eleanor hadn't hidden a message in the book. She had turned the book into a safe. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull counterpoint to Mark's cruel laughter that I could still hear in my memory. The humiliation he dealt out had fueled me to this moment. I carefully examined the edges of the linen cover near the spine, eventually finding an almost invisible seam that was sealed with wax, perfectly matched to the fabric. I gently inserted my pocket knife and separated the seal. The front cover swung open with a soft, precise click, revealing a shallow, velvet-lined metal box sunk into the space where the pages should have been. The treasure wasn't a poem or a metaphor. It was real, physical, and locked away. The hollowed-out book, Volume 4, Iceland, A Geological History, sat heavily in my hands, a silent, beautiful testament to Eleanor's foresight. Mark wouldn't have given this dusty volume a second glance. For him, wealth existed only on a spreadsheet. For Eleanor, it could be hidden right in front of him, cloaked in sentimentality and paper. I ran my fingers over the velvet lining of the compartment. Inside was a small, polished brass box, not much bigger than a deck of cards. It was an antique trinket box, the kind Eleanor used to collect. It had a delicate, old-fashioned latch, but no obvious lock or keyhole. I knew better than to force it. Eleanor's puzzles were always about finesse, not brute strength. I examined the brass box, turning it over slowly. On the underside, almost invisible against the tarnished metal, was a tiny engraved symbol, the stylized capital letter W nestled inside a heart. W for William. The lock was clearly a combination mechanism, a 3-digit dial disguised as part of the decorative trim. I realized the combination couldn't be random. It had to be another piece of our history. I cycled through all the usual numbers. My birthday, her birthday, our anniversary. Nothing. The combination had to be tied to the Iceland dream, the map, or the book itself. I looked back at the title of the book, Volume 4, Iceland, A Geological History. The IV, 4, was a possibility, but it needed 3 digits. I remembered the year we first pointed to Iceland on the map, 1985. Too many digits. Then, a detail from our life flashed in my mind. When we were first married and deeply in debt, Eleanor used to say, "The day we can pay off the mortgage, that's our Independence Day." The mortgage number was 483, but that wasn't special enough. I looked again at the map, specifically at Reykjavik. When we dreamt of that trip, Eleanor had jokingly calculated the precise latitude and longitude of the capital for fun, writing the coordinates on a scrap of paper that now hung framed in the study 64° north, 24° west. Wait. The latitude was 64. The longitude was 21. Together they made 4 digits, 6421. I tried the first 3, 6 at 42. The dial clicked softly into place, but the latch held. I tried the last 3, 421. Again, nothing. Desperation began to creep in, whispering that Mark was right, that this was just a sentimental piece of junk. Then I remembered Eleanor's professional side. She taught students to memorize the major time zones, GMT, UTC offsets. Iceland is at UTC 0. No, wait. I looked at the year of the book's publication, 1978. I looked at the date she signed her teaching contract, 1980. Finally, I focused on the core clue, the first 3 numbers that mattered most to us. Our wedding date was 0704. Not quite right. The number of years we had been married when Mark was born, 5. It was too vague. I thought about the $10,000 debt Mark had used to crucify me. That debt defined my humiliation. That debt had to be the key. I tried the digits in order of the debt value Mark had mocked. 100. Click. The latch sprung open. The irony was sweet. Mark's relentless focus on that $10,000 debt was the very thing that finally gave me the power to undo him. Inside the brass box, resting on the crimson velvet, were not stacks of cash, but a bundle of brittle, ivory-colored papers. I lifted the bundle of ivory-colored papers from the small brass box. They were old, brittle, and smelled faintly of basement storage and time. They weren't banknotes or gold coins. They were far more complex and dangerous. The irony was almost a physical weight. Mark, the financial genius, would only respect a stack of $100 bills. Eleanor had left me papers, documents so dense and sophisticated that he would have dismissed them as worthless historical artifacts had he found them. The top sheet was an official certificate, heavy linen paper with elaborate green borders covered in archaic fonts and official stamps. It wasn't issued by a bank. It was a stock certificate, dated over 20 years ago. The name of the company was Novatech Solutions. I had vaguely heard the name years ago, back when Mark first started his career, and dismissed the company as a risky, speculative micro-cap nobody. Eleanor, it turned out, hadn't just been teaching geography. She had quietly been investing in the kind of future-forward technology Mark bragged about controlling. The paper stated I was holding certificates for a substantial number of shares. But the real kicker was the next document, a trust deed. This wasn't part of Eleanor's main will or the estate Mark was executing. It was a separate living trust established by Eleanor years ago and named the Austerity Trust. I read the complex, confusing legalese, my carpenter's brain struggling with terms like irrevocable, grantor, and succession rights. But one sentence pierced through the dense jargon with terrifying clarity. Upon the death of the grantor, Eleanor, the full holdings of the Austerity Trust shall pass immediately and exclusively to the named beneficiary, William R. Davies, bypassing standard probate proceedings. The implications were staggering. These assets weren't subject to Mark's control or the main will he had mocked. They were legally separate, locked away by a trust designed to protect me, not just from poverty, but specifically from Mark's greedy intervention. But what were they worth now? I pulled out my phone, my hand trembling, not from weakness, but from an almost electric anticipation. I quickly typed Novatech Solutions stock price. The current valuation flashed on the screen. After years of obscurity, the company had not only survived, but had become a major player in renewable energy tech. The market cap was in the billions. I did some rough math based on the share count in my hand. The initial figure Mark had expected me to struggle for, $10,000, was obliterated. The value of these certificates, this secret fortune, was hovering just above $2 million. The realization slammed into me. Eleanor had known exactly what she was doing. She didn't leave me an easy inheritance. She left me a final, intricate challenge designed to force me to value my own memory over my son's cynicism. And she had given me the financial weapon to finally, irrevocably silence his toxic contempt. I didn't cheer or shout. I just sat in the quiet study, the $2 million fortune resting in my trembling hands, and a single thought crystallized. It's time to call the lawyer. The real game was about to begin. The weight of the $2 million was less financial and more emotional. It wasn't just money. It was Eleanor's final act of love and protection. The adrenaline of the discovery gave way to a cold, calculated calm. I knew I couldn't face Mark with these certificates alone. I needed a legal fortress, and Mr. Thompson, the stoic lawyer, was the key. I had to approach this with the same precision Eleanor used when hiding the assets. I called Mr. Thompson the next morning from a payphone downtown, a paranoid but necessary move to avoid any possibility of Mark intercepting the call. Thompson sounded professionally detached when he answered. I kept my voice low and steady. Mr. Thompson, this is William Davies. I have found some unusual paperwork related to Eleanor's affairs. A couple of old stock certificates and a formal trust deed. I need your professional opinion immediately, but I must stress, complete confidentiality from my son, Mark. Thompson's tone shifted from indifference to a cautious curiosity. He told me to immediately send secure copies of the documents. I followed his instructions, using a certified service, and then waited the longest 2 hours of my life. When he called back, the shift in his voice was undeniable. It wasn't the sound of excitement, but the sound of profound professional realization. "Mr. Davies," he said, the silence after my name thick with respect. "These documents, the Austerity Trust, it is sound, remarkably so. It was executed flawlessly over 20 years ago." I swallowed hard, cutting straight to the chase. "And the value, Mr. Thompson? The Novatech Solutions shares?" "Roughly $2 million, Mr. Davies, possibly more depending on the current trading day. But the most crucial detail, this is an irrevocable, separate trust. It was designed to function outside of the primary will and bypasses all standard probate proceedings. Mark, as executor of the primary estate, has absolutely no claim, no control, and no knowledge of this asset. It is legally yours outright right now." A profound sense of vindication washed over me. Eleanor hadn't just given me wealth, she had given me the perfect, untouchable weapon. "Thank you," I said simply. "Now I need you to arrange a final meeting. Call Mark. Tell him the meeting is strictly to formally close the matter of the $10,000 debt. The final settlement, no big deal. But I want both of us in the room. I want to look him in the eye when the final score is settled." Thompson hesitated for only a second, catching the cold intent in my request. "Understood, Mr. Davies. It will be scheduled for tomorrow morning." I hung up, my hands no longer trembling. Mark was playing chess with a pawn he thought was worthless, but Eleanor had secretly armed that pawn with a queen. I went home and carefully pressed the stock certificates flat, preparing them for their spectacular debut. The next morning, the lawyer's office felt charged with electricity. Mark was there first, leaning back in his chair with his feet crossed, radiating casual arrogance. I walked in, carrying only a thin brown envelope. Mark barely glanced up. "Well, look who decided to show up," he sneered. "Ready to officially close the book on your inheritance, Dad? I instructed Thompson to keep this brief. I have actual assets to manage." Mr. Thompson entered, professional and utterly unreadable, sitting down and placing a fresh file folder on the desk. He clearly knew what was coming, but his demeanor was the picture of neutrality. Mark, still oblivious, began the preemptive attack, seizing the stage before the lawyer could speak. "So, Thompson, just confirm for my father's benefit. The $10,000 owed to the estate is now officially offset by the generous cancellation in the will. No cash exchange, no further claims, correct? William's net inheritance, 0. He delivered the word 0 with vicious emphasis, leaning in to watch me squirm. I didn't flinch. I let him finish, every word of his cruel summary tightening the knot of satisfaction in my chest. When he finally looked at me, triumphant, I spoke, my voice low and steady, startling him with its new authority. "Mark," I said, "you are technically correct about the $10,000 debt. It is settled. But you've missed one crucial detail in your financial analysis." Before he could interrupt, I reached forward, placed the brown envelope on the table, and calmly slid out the fragile ivory-colored stock certificates and the trust deed. I laid the papers directly in front of Mark. Mark blinked, his smug expression freezing, replaced by confusion. "What is this, more sentimentality, old paper?" He tried to brush them aside, but Mr. Thompson suddenly put a hand on the documents, effectively stopping him. Thompson finally spoke, his voice clear and resonant. "Mark, these documents were provided to me by your father yesterday. They are a separate, legally binding entity known as the Austerity Trust, established by your mother, Eleanor Davies, 2 decades ago." He pointed to the top certificate. "These are certificates representing a substantial holding in Novatech Solutions." Thompson continued, delivering the fatal blow without emotion. I have verified the trust's validity and the current market value. As per the deed, the full approximately $2 million value of this trust was immediately and legally transferred to your father, William Davies, upon Eleanor's passing. These assets were never part of the general estate and were explicitly designed to bypass probate and your executorship. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was deafening. Mark's face went utterly white. His eyes, fixed on the certificates, betrayed a dizzying cascade of greed, shock, and sudden absolute comprehension. He looked from the papers to Mr. Thompson and finally at me, the man he had just called a worthless debtor. The realization that his mother had used their most intimate memories to arm me against his cynicism, and that he had actively mocked the very key to his $2 million loss, was the perfect, crippling form of revenge. He didn't just lose money, he lost face, power, and control in one devastating, calculated moment. The confrontation ended not with a bang, but with a horrifying, strangled whimper from Mark. He didn't erupt, he simply imploded. The smug financier, the cold calculator who valued people only by their net worth, had been legally and emotionally eviscerated by his late mother. He didn't fight Mr. Thompson because the legal wall was impenetrable. He just stared at the documents, then at me, his eyes wide with utter, consuming disbelief and pure, impotent fury. He finally stood up, knocking his chair slightly. Mark said nothing, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of betrayal and hatred. He simply gathered his briefcase, gave me a look that promised eternal resentment, and fled the room. He didn't even acknowledge the lawyer or the receptionist on his way out. He had lost $2 million and, far more importantly, the power he craved over me. His final insult, his last laugh, had cost him everything. Thompson and I sat in silence for a long moment. Then the lawyer slowly leaned back, a faint, almost imperceptible smile finally touching his lips. "Mr. Davies," he said, shaking his head, "in 40 years I have never seen a more elegant or complete act of foresight. Your wife was extraordinary. She didn't just protect you, she delivered justice. The victory wasn't about the money, it was the profound, soul-cleansing liberation from Mark's toxic control. The weight of the $10,000 debt, the symbol of my failure, was gone, replaced by an independence I hadn't known since I was a young man." Thompson immediately set up the sale of the shares, ensuring I didn't have to deal with Mark's inevitable legal maneuvering. The first thing I did with the realized capital was pay off the house mortgage completely, an act that meant more than any stock dividend. The second thing was booking a first-class, open-ended trip. Iceland. I wasn't going for a treasure hunt. I was going to complete the dream Eleanor and I had first shared over that old map. I took a piece of the Novatech money and, in Eleanor's honor, established a small private scholarship for local high school students studying geography and environmental sciences, focusing on those who couldn't afford college. I used her money to fund the future Mark only cared about exploiting. I am 72 now, and I'm traveling the world, one dream at a time. I have peace, I have financial security, and I know, unequivocally, that Eleanor loved me, protected me, and in her final beautiful gesture, gave me back my dignity. I didn't just get an inheritance, I got a new, happy life, unburdened by debt or toxic family relationships. The carpenter who was called a failure by his son became the benefactor who now lives his dreams. This is the end of William's story. Thank you for listening. This was an intense ride of betrayal and calculated revenge. Now I want to hear from you. Did I do the right thing by taking the inheritance and leaving Mark with the shame and the zero net gain? What would you have done in my place? If you love this story and want to hear more tales of true revenge, unbelievable drama, and hidden secrets, make sure you smash that like button, hit subscribe so you don't miss any of our next uploads, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Thank you for listening.